Okay, so this video is going to kind of recap what we've been talking about today and last week on how did World War I affect life in the U.S. So again, this is the poster where it shows the Statue of Liberty, and it's kind of geared towards immigrant audiences, reminding them that food will win the war and that they came here seeking freedom, and then now they must help to preserve it. So again, kind of appealing to different groups of Americans on how to help the U.S. government during World War I. So how did it affect life in the U.S.? Well, Americans had to deal with many shortages in food and fuel in particular. Other countries actually rationed their scarce goods. We did not. We just chose to rely on the voluntary efforts of the citizens, like meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and people just saving goods for the war effort. We just relied on the voluntary efforts of the citizens. It wasn't a requirement, it was strongly encouraged. This is, again, also when we started daylight savings time to save fuel. So, again, that had been around, I think, since Benjamin Franklin, the Revolutionary War. But World War I is when countries across the world started using it to save fuel. So that's going to change the way people live their lives. The military and the government used publicity to encourage men to volunteer to fight. So songs, parades, posters, again, kind of playing up like the great adventure that was war, that the country needs you to volunteer to fight. Very patriotic. And this is a registration card for the draft. And of course, war is very expensive, so the government tried to influence attitudes and encourage war bonds sales with a propaganda campaign at home. It was led by the Committee on Public Information, so CPI. So here we have a a Liberty Bonds poster, and it's Remember Belgium. So again, it's kind of painting the Germans in a bad light. Remember Belgium. Remember that the Germans invaded neutral Belgium, poor Belgium. Here we have a German soldier appearing to cart off a young girl. Again, painting the Germans in a bad light. Sort of like, again, Germans weren't necessarily bad, but the U.S. government wanted people to kind of buy Liberty Bonds out of anger to support the war effort. The thing that we're looking at today and tomorrow is the government tried to cut down on any activities that could hurt the war effort by passing laws that restricted Americans' rights. So these were called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So anyone who came across as anti-war or spoke out against the U.S. involvement could potentially hurt the war effort by making people not want to save on fuel and food, to not buy Liberty Bonds. So that kind of, the government saw that as a threat. So they passed these Espionage and Sedition Acts that we'll look at again in class tomorrow to kind of prevent people from speaking out against the U.S. involvement in the war. And you can see these women that say, Mr. President, remember the Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The political prisoners who believed in this guarantee are now serving 20 years in prison. So people who did speak out against U.S. involvement in World War I were put in jail, kind of violating that freedom of speech that's guaranteed in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. Again, as we talked about, immigration from Europe stopped almost completely because they're at war. This created a labor shortage, especially in the factories in the north, like in Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit. So this led to an increased immigration from Mexico and the movement of African Americans from the south to the northern cities. So again, the migration of African Americans from the south to the north is known as the Great Migration, and it kind of continues until 1970. But it starts in World War I because of that shortage in labor factories. And then again, as we talked about, Americans of German or Austrian background often face discrimination or even violence. So again, we go to war and we ally with the British and the French. And so we're against the Germans and Austrians. There were a lot of German and Austrian immigrants in the United States at the time, predominantly in Pennsylvania and the Midwest, very German backgrounds there. But German Americans and Austrian Americans would face discrimination or even violence, sometimes even death, like by lynching, because people were very anti-German, again, as a part of the propaganda campaign by the U.S. government. So again, tomorrow we're going to look at kind of what happened to you if you spoke out against the U.S. government during World War I. This is just a recap of how different groups were affected by U.S. involvement in the war and how the home front was affected.